Good morning, everyone, and apologies for the technological difficulties. My name is Tricia Rojo Bushnell, and I am the Executive Director of the Midwest Innocence Project. And I'm joined this morning by Talila Lewis, who is the Director and Founder, I believe, of HERD organization. We are also joined today by members of the deaf and disabled community, and we will be discussing topics that are related to the moment of time that we are in right now. So I want to take a second to acknowledge that, to what is going on in the world, to the protests, which are just one small part, to the extreme harm that is happening to the community in recognition of the death of George Floyd and so many others, including Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, at the hands of white supremacy and anti-Blackness in many forms through police violence. We will also be talking about police violence and its effects, police violence on deaf and disabled people and ableism in our work in general. So before we begin, I wanted to take a second to acknowledge that and give everyone a moment to breathe and have a second to take a breath and think about where we are and what is happening in this time. So to begin, we have a lot to talk about today, and you're going to hear about a lot of different issues and concepts, and we will be directing you to websites and other resources so that we can get through everything that is so important in this conversation today. I do want to start, for folks who do not know, to talk about what is the Midwest Innocence Project and the Innocence Network, and what is the work that we do. The Innocence Network is an organization of a network of 67 organizations around the world that represent people who are in prison for crimes they did not commit. And we work to investigate and get them home, bring them home by various different legal avenues, as well as to change the policies that put them there in the first place. And I think we at the Midwest Innocence Project recognize that white supremacy and anti-Blackness is one of those reasons, if not the main reason, that people are wrongfully convicted. And so we are trying to do our work to do that as well. We will also be talking today with TL about HERD, and I just wanted to start there. TL, if you could tell us about HERD, what is that organization and how it came to be?
Hey, this is TL. Thank you for the invitation to be here with you all today. I'm having a rough day today, so I need folks to bear with me. In light of all the things that are going on, I'm struggling to try to get through words and the days. I also want to acknowledge, before I move forward, a few things that are important for everyone on the call to know. One is that obviously we're working with interpreters today. Many people use languages other than English to communicate. Hello, white supremacy. So ASL is currently being used, American Sign Language, and a lot of the concepts being discussed today, we haven't developed individual signs for. So we're going to be patient and be working together with the interpreting team and the captioner to make sure that the communication is as clear as possible. What that means for attorneys on the call is that you need to be patient because things will be explained that you already know. One of the problems and one of the ways in which deaf and disabled folks find ourselves incarcerated, arrested, brutalized by law enforcement, and then not communicated with by our own defense attorneys and appellate attorneys and everyone else in the carceral system is because hearing abled, white, wealth privileged people take for granted that people don't have the same knowledge, have different levels of knowledge, et cetera. So words like exoneree don't have signs. Words like prosecutors don't have agreed upon signs. Words like mass incarceration don't have agreed upon signs. So those things we'll be expanding on, and we're going to need to be patient to make sure that communication is clear. And I will be also providing feedback to interpreters during this, and they'll be providing me feedback as well, so you all can kind of witness some of what the process looks like, which unfortunately it doesn't look like that generally in the world because of autism. So I'll answer your question now. HERD, we were established back in 2011. Initially, we thought we were going to just support folks who we noticed who were deaf and disabled, who were incarcerated without having had any access to law enforcement communication, communication with defense counsel, communication with appellate attorneys, communication with anyone in the carceral system prior to their being incarcerated. So we found several people who were at that time just deaf and who we thought were wrongfully convicted. Some of them had been in since 81. This is, so before HERD was founded, this is 2007. We were finding these folks who were deaf and incarcerated. And we tapped several large deaf and disability rights organizations who are white-led. We asked them, hey, please help. It looks like there are some deaf folks, deaf disabled folks who are innocent and have been stuck in prison for decades, many of them, all of them at that time, 40 years, 15 years, another, and another for 20-something years. And the large white-led disability and deaf rights organizations were not interested in being involved in anything related to carceral systems, incarceration, et cetera. And so gave us, it was a small community group. Oh, it's so great that you're working on that, but we're not interested in that. We tapped the Innocence, several different Innocence network organizations, and they had the knowledge, the working knowledge of exoneration and wrongful conviction, but didn't have the working knowledge of disability and deaf cultures, how that even related to how a person might be wrongfully convicted. And so we decided to go ahead and just set up an organization that kind of filled that gap. And I'll say one more thing and then I'll let you take it back over, Tricia. What ended up happening, again, we were going to focus on wrongful convictions, but as we would go and visit deaf incarcerated folks, because there were no phones, and still to this day are not phones, video phones, in the vast majority of jails and prisons across the nation, that would make it such that we can call our community members and use sign language to communicate, hey, what's your side of the story? Looks like you shouldn't be here. Let's contact some people and get you out. Video phones are not in the vast majority of jails and prisons. So we would have to use our own money, arrive at the prison, sit down, communicate and sign, figure out what the story was. And when we were doing this with several different folks, visiting prisons, visiting deaf folks in prisons, they were saying to us, so thrilled that you found me, but I'm being abused in various ways every single day in this prison. I don't have access to basic communication. I'm, decompensating mentally because of no communication with anyone. Can you do something to change the material conditions of my everyday life? Because there was a recognition that they would be there for a while. And so we kind of shifted our attention at that time to supporting folks at every phase of the legal system, not just folks who were innocent, but our community was being abused inside prisons, regardless of guilt or innocence. So we shifted in that way. And now we're becoming even more radical. We've actually become a prison abolitionist organization because we acknowledge that there is actually no way, in fact, that the carceral system can serve our community. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you.
Well, I think you're bringing up this is Tricia talking, a lot of important points. And one of the things that I think I just want to clarify for folks who are listening is the difference between also what innocence organizations do and representing people who are wrongfully convicted, or representing people who have or who are in prison and prison conditions and other claims, or prison abolition work generally, right? So the Innocence Network and innocence organizations, we only represent people who are what the system determines to be called actually innocent of a crime, meaning they did not commit the crime and you can prove it, right? A wrongful conviction is where someone was convicted, and it may be that their conviction was wrongful because they are innocent and did not commit the crime. It may also be that their conviction was wrongful because the system did all of these illegal things that they shouldn't be allowed to do, and that makes it wrongful, right? That folks didn't follow the rules. But then there's also the work that you're talking about that HERD is taking on, or that other organizations are taking on, of combating mass incarceration generally and the use of the prison system generally. So I want to just clarify that for folks who are listening to be able to understand. because it strikes me, one of the things you brought up really early was talking about how lawyers, is just one way in white supremacy, use language that is not accessible to everyone, or we talk to people in ways where we assume that they must talk our way, or communicate in our way, not even speak, right? And that keeps people apart. And so I'm interested in what are some of the ways that you would hope lawyers would learn and be able to access to break that barrier down and really give people service that they deserve.
Yeah, I think this is TL. I think that lawyers put way too much faith in the criminal legal system, right? What white supremacy has done is it's made us lean on a system that we, my community, both disabled, Black, queer, have known for generations, was set up to incarcerate, surveil, and control us. And so long as there is this almost intractable trust in this system by lawyers who really do need the system to maintain itself, to have a job and to look great and to say, oh, pat me on the back, I got one innocent person out of prison. And that's not to dismiss the work, it's valuable work, but we need to be fighting against the larger system and not just understanding one individualized harm as one individualized harm. Like that was an intentional thing, right? There were many steps in the system that led to the vulnerability making of that person being able to be incarcerated for 50, 20, however many years. So I think the first step is us admitting that the criminal legal system is unjust, right? Stop calling the criminal legal system a justice system, right? What we as lawyers have to do is utilize our privilege to uplift the truth about the problems inherent in the system in which we are a part. And I think that is really, really important. I think it's also taking a step back and being humble and allowing folks from multiply marginalized communities to lead in language, to lead in perspective provision, to lead in pretty much every way possible. If Black folks for generations have been saying this system was literally set up to kill us, that is some language that maybe white folks need to start taking on, as opposed to, oh, the system is broken. Oh, we might need to tinker with it here and tinker with it there. So I think there needs to be a fundamental shift in how we do education of law students, lawyers, judges. Honestly, there's so little understanding of every single form of systemic oppression that it is terrifying to people like me who can see those things. And I think most deeply, there needs to be a deep understanding of the connections between racism, classism, ableism, and other forms of systemic oppression, and the role they play in the creation, maintenance, and enabling of the legal system to continue to enact the harms that it enacts. I think the law in and of itself puts lawyers in a particularized box, right? You have to pull from one particularized law to protect one particularized client on these several facts, right? Not thinking outside of that box is the trouble that we find ourselves in often. So I would encourage lawyers to really do the work to unpack all of their privileges. That would be abled privilege, hearing privilege, white privilege, wealth privilege, literacy privilege. There's so many layers to it. It's hard to even begin. It's not just about the language that we're using in our everyday conversation. It's like a systemic shift in everything that we think we know about this system. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. This is Tricia. One of the things that you were touching on, I think the community right now is very comfortable, or starting to get comfortable. They're not very comfortable. We've never been comfortable talking about racial issues or racism, right? But we're starting to believe we should at least talk about it. We're getting to the step where we're starting to believe we should talk about it. But you were mentioning all of the many layers and how many different ones there are. And one of them that you mentioned is ableism, which you said at the very beginning, we don't even have a sign for. So I'm interested in if you could unpack that and how that plays in the criminal legal system. And also because, we were speaking a little bit beforehand and you mentioned how lawyers aren't even recognizing, and including those of us in the Innocence Network, that many of our clients, the majority of our clients that we serve, have disabilities, and we're not even seeing that. And so I was hoping you could speak to us and expound on that, about what you're seeing and what we should be doing.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So I think in general, when people discuss the criminal legal system and mass incarceration, often what comes up now, because it's easier to see because there's a lot of empirical evidence, right? Which is what a lot of white folks tend to need to believe narratives from Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other marginalized folks. Okay, so folks will talk about racial inequities and tend to also be able to understand the inequities, class-related inequities. What most folks aren't understanding are how race, class intersect with disability and other systemic oppressions to create the vulnerabilities that we see, to surveillance and hyper-policing and violence, et cetera. So I've created a definition of ableism that I think will help kind of ground the conversation moving forward. What we know is that our education systems, our legal systems, pretty much the entire society functions on particularized ideas of what it means to be normal, what it means to behave properly, what it means to be all of those things. What we have to acknowledge is that every single person from every different culture and community has different norms. Because of white supremacy, the norm that's been placed on people's bodies, minds, functioning, productivity in the US context is a very white supremacist one. And so the definition of ableism I'll provide here tries to kind of fill in the gaps. So my definition of ableism is that it's a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. And that these constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. That these particularized forms of systemic oppression lead to people in society determining who is valuable and worthy based on their appearance, ability to satisfactorily produce or reproduce, excel, and behave. And the most important part of the definition is that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. So ideas around non-compliance with law enforcement. I'm writing a piece right now called An Ode to the Runners, an ode to Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks who fight or run from law enforcement. That in fact, those are very natural responses if you come from a community that for generations has been accosted, assailed, violated, murdered by a particular group of people. That if that reaction cloaked in white skin was the norm for white people, there would be an immediate label of disability attached to that response: fighting, flighting, freezing, right? Those are very natural responses to trauma. We know that, but not when it's in Black or Brown or Indigenous skin, not when that's our reaction to the state, a system of oppression and violence that we've been experiencing since time immemorial in this country, that is quite literally stolen, right? And so I think there's very little understanding of how Black and Brown Indigenous bodies experience disability. The ways in which we talk about disability are not how white Western European people talk about disability. Often we talk about disability without saying the word disability because it's not safe for us to actually be disabled, because that's another targeting factor on us. So our disabilities tend to arise in very different ways than white folks' disabilities. And our disabilities get a lot less attention, prioritization, and certainly they don't get the diagnoses that would lend themselves to providing us accommodations, like getting the police out of our neighborhoods, providing us resources, material resources and supports to ensure that our trauma and grief, generational poverty, impoverishment is healed or filled, that reparations are had for the violence that we've experienced. Those would be some meaningful ways to address some of these things. That doesn't happen. Instead, when we run, when we fight, that is then further punished. And it's not just punished, it's pathologized. And so one more thing, just the historical context is really important. People who escaped from enslavement were labeled insane and criminal simultaneously. People who refused to work during enslavement were labeled insane and simultaneously criminalized, right? So there's a connection in the United States context that has been created by the United States government and other capitalist classes that connect delinquency, dependency, and so-called deficiency or disability. And so if you look back at the US Census, 1880 census, you'll see those three words. It's the first time that they created these schedules. In the 1840 census of the United States, it was the first time where the United States decided that they wanted to track idiocy and lunacy in the United States population. And a lot of what they were trying to do was bring the idea that Black folks were inherently intellectually inferior, physically meant for just manual labor and production. And in fact, that 1840 census said that they found that the incidences of idiocy and lunacy in the northern freed Black population was higher than idiocy and lunacy in the enslaved Southern populations, right? And so if we don't understand our history, and if we aren't honest about these things, those things kind of slip, and we don't realize that resisting arrest is quite literally the progeny of drapetomania, which was escape from enslavement, right? Like if we're not actually practicing unpacking those things, it's easy to just miss it and start to say, oh, well, why didn't that Black person just put their hands up and stand still? When often the Black person is doing that and we still die. And so we have to just kind of acknowledge the genesis of the responses that we all have, and the genesis of the authoritarian, domineering complex that the system and the state has. And there's very little of that within the legal profession writ large.
Yeah, I've so many places to unpack with that. One of the things I've appreciated that even just in this conversation, you are continually reteaching me is the importance of specificity, right? So we talked a little bit before about using words like people of color, and you just use Black, Indigenous, and Latinx as a specific way, so people know specifics and we know what we're talking about with the clarity of our communication. So I hear you talking and talking about the use of the system, making the line from when slaves were escaped to, I'm not sure I'm going to remember the word, drapetomania, which is how they then clarified it as a like a mental problem. Is that what that was, that they were calling that? To now where we are now with resisting arrest. And I'm wondering if you can give us some other specific examples to help people understand and grapple with what are ways that disability is being misunderstood in the Black community or in other Latinx or Indigenous communities.
Yeah, this is TL. So, several examples of deaf folks who use sign language to communicate, who were all Black and Indigenous that I have examples of, who when law enforcement came to them would grab them while they're trying to sign communicate. And the simple attempt to communicate is deemed violent, intransigent, worthy of more force and violence, arrest, and incarceration. Oftentimes we've seen the interplay of, and we have to understand psych institutions as just another arm of the carceral system. They're not separate. And I don't have time to get into the connections between plantations, prisons, circuses, zoos, and psych asylums, but just know that that exists. And we can maybe have a whole other conversation about those. But a Black deaf young person was attempting to communicate with their child, trying to teach the child sign language. This is 2 years ago. Police were called. Who knows why? Because the child is light skinned, because the partner is actually a light skinned Latinx person. Police are called, show up. Deaf person attempts to explain what's happening. Law enforcement, again, escalates the situation, right? Like situations don't get escalated until law enforcement arrive, which we need to be clear about that. So gets upset, starts grabbing the person. The person, reasonably says, hey, I'm trying to explain. They then arrest the person and give him what's called a rough ride, slam him around in the back of a police car, and they label him as having mental illness so they can put him, Baker Act him essentially, put him in a psych ward for several days without having access to his family, right? Without having access to anything. These are the ways in which the carceral system treats Black folks, brown folks, low-income folks, deaf folks, disabled folks, that are kind of layered onto like what we already see as injustice. So what we're witnessing often is a person can't show up to court because they can't afford it. A person knows that communication access is not going to be had at court, and that if they show up, they're going to fail, so they don't want to go back to jail, right? There are legitimate ways in which the system further marginalizes already marginalized people. And it's worth noting that our laws are quite literally selectively enforced in the ways in which they want to be, the system wants to enforce them. And so those are like probably not even the best examples that I can give, but often just right, being Black and doing something like reading a book looks strange to white supremacists who think Black people can't simply be sitting in a car reading. Like that looks, why would a Black person be reading, right? Like, and so young man and an elder who had traumatic brain injury, and his name is escaping me right now, was literally sitting in a car and was shot and killed by cops. That was 3 years ago, and we were protesting for that, right? Like most of the people killed by law enforcement are in fact disabled people. Most of the folks in our jails and prisons are in fact disabled people. If you go into prison without disabilities, you come out disabled because prison is inherently disabling. And so there's like layers again to that. Also, when we look into the carceral system at, let's take for instance, literacy. Right now, the literacy, English literacy, to be clear, for adults on the inside is something like 60% read at or below functional literacy. And then of our youth population, about 85% read at or below functional literacy. That is an indication of a targeting of a particularized groups of folks who, one, have been deprived of formalized access to education intentionally by the government. That's really important to name. And the reason I bring up literacy is not because literacy inherently means someone is far superior, what have you. There's different kinds of intelligence. That's not acknowledged in any of the systems in the United States by and large. But the reason I bring that up is because literacy has been used time immemorial, like quite literally hundreds and hundreds of years, to label people less intelligent, to also criminalize people. So Black folks who attempted to read and write were criminalized, could be beaten, killed, eyes gouged out, hands chopped off. Like quite literally, these were the things that are going on. And then fast forward a couple of generations, oh, if you can't read and write, then you don't have access to any of the things that a person might need to live a safe and secure life. Literacy was also then used during Jim Crow to cut off access to the ballot. So civic death comes by and through intentional deprivation of formalized access to education. So there's so many ways in which the system utilizes these deprivations. And we have to understand that trauma and deprivation of resources is a cause and consequence of disability. And so a lot of the ways in which multiply marginalized folks experience their disabilities, or what would be labeled disabled if white folks had those same behaviors or what have you, is because of systemic deprivation of education, water, housing, food, those sorts of things. And those are things that are just not considered or really cared about. And then the coping mechanisms that are utilized to try to navigate dealing with, so drug use, for example, is then also criminalized, right? When quite literally that is what folks need to get by because of the systemic deprivation and violence and trauma that they're experiencing in their homes, communities, et cetera. And so those are some of the ways, and I'm gonna be quiet because I've been talking too long.
No,
Go ahead, Tricia.
This is Tricia. I mean, I'm appreciating all of this. And one of the connections that is so clear to me as well, and that I would hope you would speak about a little bit, is you're talking about literacy. And for us, when we're trying to communicate with clients in prison, our options are in-person visits, right? Letters, which are not observed, are phone calls, which we never know if they're listening or not, right? So there's a lot of questions, and by they, I mean the prison or the prosecutor's office, or if they're listening in on our calls. And so if letters are a way that many lawyers are communicating with their clients, then that is inherently already not accommodating for a disability, right? That is a generational of occurrence. So what I'm hoping you can talk about are other ways in which lawyers can be doing a better job or making our communications accessible to the folks that we serve.
This is TL, so I appreciate that question. When I presented at you all's conference a couple years back, I talked about your intake processes. This is just a great example. Some of your network organizations have intake processes packets that are 48 pages with questions like, what is the procedural posture of your case? You know, that's not accessible to the vast majority of people, even those who could read, right? But like, you're screening out multiply marginalized people, when what you want to be doing is screening marginalized people in. So the goal would be to make your package, and I get it, right? We're all completely overwhelmed. HERD receives so much mail from across the nation and all of our colonies or territories that it's, you know, I get that. I know that all of you are behind in your cases, but what ends up happening is that you screen in the people who have the resources, who have connections already. You screen those people in, and those cases actually tend to be much more hard to fight than most of our folks who have disabilities and who are deaf, who have relatively easy cases to identify as really jacked up in terms of process, in terms of all of the things. And you would spend less time on 10 cases than you do on the one that you end up selecting because they were able to get through this 48-page packet. It's important to note that our folks, deaf and disabled folks, would benefit from, let me back up a little bit. There's no one in the entire criminal legal system that effectively communicates with deaf signing people, to be clear. I just want to be very clear about that. From point A to Z, the entire system is stacked against deaf signing folks, deaf disabled folks. And that's true of most marginalized communities, but I want to name that forthrightly. And so what we find is that the trial attorney has, I don't even have the words, has allowed the deaf client to sit in front of a police officer and tell their story through a police signing officer, right? Those sorts of clear violations of everything we know to be correct and right. Defense attorneys aren't hiring attorneys to effectively communicate with their own deaf clients. Our courts are allowing siblings to interpret for their loved ones. That happened in Mississippi 2 years ago. A CODA, a child of deaf adults, Black family, right? Who's not going to buck the system, right? Whether you're hearing or deaf, if you're Black in Mississippi and a white judge tells you to do something, you do it. And so I don't think there's, again, understanding of that. Parole, probation, diversionary, none of that stuff is accessible. And so in terms of access, again, lawyers should be pushing for basic things like video phones in prisons. Why is it that HERD is the only organization that is functionally saying this is not acceptable? We can't talk to any of our clients without having functionally equivalent communication access here. That seems very basic. That should be in every jail, every prison. If you're going to be incarcerating our community members, they need to have access to counsel, to loved ones, to obviously they're assaulted more often, unfortunately, in various ways. There's a 24-hour day hotline.
This is Tricia.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to comment on that to see your client is so critical, and to see how they change over time, or how they appear, or how they look, that you can't know if you can't see them. That you can't recognize other symptomology or things that may be happening if you can't see them. That wouldn't come through over the phone. I think is just such an important thing that resonated with me very deeply.
This is TL, that's right. The other thing that's important for folks in your network to know is that because of, am I freezing or are you freezing? Seems the interpreter can see me clearly. Okay. Another thing that's important for your network to know is that with the complete deprivation of all communication of deaf folks who are, for instance, awaiting trial in jail, language capacities completely decline and regress. And often by the time they arrive in court for whatever it might be, a plea, trial, or whatever, because of the cruel and unusual and violent deprivation of all communication, it's often that your client arrives not even being able to functionally understand what's happening. And so having lawyers be involved in ensuring that there are video phones in jails if you have deaf clients, that's just one simple way to do it. Yeah, and I'll stop there because I don't want to talk too much about that. Go ahead, Tricia.
Well, I mean, I think that these are the critical things that people would like to know, because, you know, we talk a lot about folks who want to help, but what can they do, right? People, like for lawyers, what are specifics that lawyers should be doing, and what should we be doing? What are the changes in the criminal legal system we should be making that will recognize and accommodate this, also recognizing that HERD is an abolitionist organization. So what does that look like that people can take action for?
This is TL. I think you presume that with one, you don't presume that you handle a deaf case in the same way that you handle a hearing person's case. So often hearing attorneys are trying to just say, oh, this is just another case. I'm so used to this, and shrug, really take for granted that what you need to do is call in deaf specialists, disabled specialists, deaf mental health counselors, deaf interpreters, folks who actually understand our communities. Because what I've found is in looking at a lot of the just simple writing back and forth with law enforcement, which if you all don't know, because ASL is a full language and other sign languages are full languages, often deaf folks who are incarcerated, especially, didn't know English when they were being interrogated by law enforcement by writing back and forth on papers. And so one of the things is you should assume 1,000 errors in these cases, right? And the errors are common, they're easy to spot, but you need to invite deaf communities to be in on reviewing that content. Please don't be ego-driven and just go it alone. Contact people who could be able to give you insight. One example, a sentence that would be very simply misunderstood by hearing attorneys, like, girl, I hit, didn't I? In sign language is completely the opposite meaning. You're negating, you're saying, I didn't hit that person. On written paper, it looks like a person might be saying that they did do something. Read technique, I tell people that read technique, R-E-I-D, read technique, which is a common interrogation and interview tactic utilized by law enforcement, mixed with disability, is the best recipe for wrongful conviction. The behaviors that are listed as evidence of untruthfulness are all disability and deaf behaviors, quite literally. And so when we talk about police targeting people for normal behavior, obviously non-disabled folks are targeted, but the list of behaviors in the read technique, pamphlets, books, brochures, quite literally, I can go down all of them. I have gone through all of them. And we are literally looking at a recipe for wrongful conviction of our people. So cross-cultural miscommunication. Another good example, John Wilson, who recently passed away, spent 25 years in prison, sign name JW on the arm, spent 25 years in federal prison after being interrogated by a fingerspelling Black police officer in the District of Columbia, fingerspelling police officer about murder. And I don't even want to get into that. Point is, one of the other cross-cultural, so that's one example of cross-cultural miscommunication. Second is all of the things that read technique tell you might be indicative of, some sort of untruthfulness. The third is wherein deaf folks, often deaf-sighted people, there are deaf-blind people in our prisons, but deaf-sighted people often will refer to things by visual, how things are visually set up. So if they wanted to explain what you look like, they might say a white presenting person with their hair kind of this way, circle glasses, shorter nose, long nose this way, blue chair, red wall, like quite literally describe everything you see. So in signing communities, we have name signs and we have other very clear visual, like my sign name is TL. So most of the people in my community have no idea how to spell my name because you wouldn't need to spell my name. Oh, TL, lawyer, black, short hair, glasses, that one, often present on law, da, da, da. That's how I'm referred to. Most people have no idea what my name is. A law enforcement, even if they've known me 20 years, law enforcement says, well, why wouldn't you know that person's name if you've known them 20 years? Well, because we use sign and we don't need to know the person's name. But an example in John Wilson's case is law enforcement had found the decedent in his case, the dead body in the case. And John Wilson was trying to help them identify whether or not that's the missing person. So John says, well, hey, did that body, the body that you're referencing, did it have a missing tooth? Was there a tooth missing? Unfortunately, that particular body had been bludgeoned to death. So yes, in fact, it was missing teeth. But had you asked anyone in the deaf community, what he was trying to do was say, hey, that missing person who we're looking for has a sign name that is related to a missing tooth that they've been missing for years. And I'm trying to help you identify the dead body. Instead, again, that was utilized as some sort of evidence of him knowing things that he had no idea about, right? Simple cross-cultural miscommunication that quite literally helped lead to him being incarcerated for 25 years and dying 6 months after he was released due to the trauma and violence of depriving him of communication, Federal Bureau of Prisons, for 25 years, where he only saw an interpreter 2 times in the span of 25 years of incarceration as a signing person. The trauma and violence of what's going on for deaf signing people in prisons can't be encapsulated in any language. And I think I have to name that. And so I'll stop there, but I hope that gives some ideas about some of the red flags that folks can look for. Any writing back and forth with police officers, anytime a signing cop is signing, I don't care if they're a CODA, born of deaf people, anytime that happens, those are where we most often see wrongful convictions. Anytime where there's visual things that are stated that could very easily be misinterpreted. I could create a list of these things, but these are the very common things that happen. I don't know if that's enough. Go ahead, Tricia.
This is Tricia. When you're talking about, looking at cases and finding cases, what is also the experience of someone who is incarcerated that is deaf and disabled? Like, what are the other particular things that folks should know about that experience to be able to understand and accommodate any additional things that are coming up? Does that make sense? So, we know we're talking about what leads someone who's deaf and disabled, both the targeting and the way it's viewed, right? The way the deaf disability is viewed or treated leads people to be wrongfully convicted. So what happens to folks once they're in prison?
So I think it's a little bit of what I just talked about. I think you're asking me 2 questions. Are you asking me common disabilities that deaf folks who are incarcerated have? Is that one of your questions?
This is such a great example of how when you don't quite know all the language and how important language is, right? That I'm not communicating clearly. What I'm asking is like how to share you said you wanted to name the experience that folks who are disabled or deaf in prison have. And I'm wondering if you can highlight that or share that for folks like me who don't have that experience to know and appreciate what that is.
This is TL. I wrote a piece in Truth Out called "In the Fight to Close Rikers, Don't Forget About Deaf and Disabled People," that really encapsulates it well. Deaf and disabled folks are punished for not hearing commands that they can't hear, are placed in solitary indefinitely, are decompensating even in the general population due to, it's beyond language deprivation. It's quite literally communication deprivation at levels that there's nothing written on how the mental effects of incarceration on deaf folks. I call it virtual solitary confinement because a lot of the behaviors that start to arise are very similar to people who've been in extreme isolation. And then solitary is also used against deaf folks as well. So that's a whole other layer. I recognize we have about 7 minutes left. But no access to anything, more punishment, more time added to sentences, no access to parole hearings. Most of our appellate attorneys really further destroy their possibilities at being released because appellate attorneys also don't understand deaf and disability cultures, don't understand how to frame proper legal arguments to get folks out. No access to their client also, right? No ability to call using video phone services like they might with their hearing clients who might also struggle, probably also struggle with reading and comprehension in similar ways.
So this is Tricia. How has quarantine affected that and affected the work, the ability? And it seems to me if you can't see someone, that has an even greater hardship here.
Yeah, this is TL. I think for us, one of the things we've been fighting for since before our inception is trying to get video phones in for folks. Another thing that's really benefited a lot of deaf folks is fighting for interpreters to be involved in news casts. Captions are insufficient to reach the broad swath of folks who use sign language as a language. Sure, captions work for some people, but other folks can't read those. Most TVs in jails and prisons don't have captions or interpreters, to be clear. Again, that goes back to the systematic torture in terms of just no stimulation, no communication that deaf folks are experiencing in jails and prisons. But yeah, I mean, so with COVID, we've been intentionally setting up client appointments. What we've found is that prisons and jails have not informed deaf folks of any information about the pandemic, about how to protect themselves, about any of these things, social distancing, none of that is being shared with them. So we have a hotline that we've set up. It's the only national prison hotline, deaf national prison hotline. And we have a tiny team of volunteers trying to respond to that. Obviously, only a few deaf incarcerated people, relatively speaking. If we have over 5,000 jails and prisons in the nation, about 100 have actual video phone access. So again, we're looking at a very small population that's able to do that. But we've been intentionally setting up legal calls with as many of the folks we've been able to find and put in our database so we can physically see them, make sure they're alive so they don't get disappeared further by the system. But there's very few attorneys working on deaf wrongful conviction cases. And that's something that I would really encourage you all to try to do. And our team would be happy to train you about deaf and disability cultures. We've done that with some law clinics. We've done that with the Innocence Network before, kind of on a more surface level, but more deep understanding of these things, I think will help with all clients, not just deaf and disabled folks. But again, pretty much all of your clients have disabilities anyway. So it's important to have a disability lens on the work that you're doing as well. And I think that would help with forming proper arguments and framing proper arguments on habeas petitions, et cetera. And we would love to have training from you all because our communities are so behind on this information. Because you all are overwhelmed, maybe we can support with helping to draft some of these petitions, but we need knowledge sharing. So I think this is about like collective sharing around these things. Often I see large networks hold things close to their chests. So it's hard for small entities that with no money and all volunteers to get access to those things. Maybe making that stuff free and making sure that there's access so people can just learn what is a habeas petition, how can we start to help? Because then maybe we submit that information to you all prepped and ready. So I'm thinking about ways that we can be in collaboration beyond just these conversations once every couple of years, although I do appreciate them. Go ahead, Tricia.
Well, I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation where you're tired of hearing from me, because I don't want it every couple of years. I would like to have it. And that is a commitment that I'm making today, that I want us to be doing that work, and in addition to trainings and other things that you've identified. But I know we only have a few minutes left. And so one of the things that I really want to make sure is that how do people learn more about HEARD and learn about how to support your work, and what can they do to support your work?
So this is TL. We have a great and active Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter pages. So on Twitter and Instagram, we're at Be Heard DC, BEHEARD DC on both of those. On Facebook, we're /Heard DC, HEARD DC. And we recently put out an infographic on wrongful convictions of deaf and disabled people in December of last year. It's yellow and blue. So if you go on any of our pages, look for that yellow and blue. We have it in ASL and English, hoping to get it translated into Spanish soon. There's a short link for it, bit.ly/deaf wrongful conviction, all lowercase, capital E in English. So English. So ENG, yes, that. So those are some ways that you can just kind of start learning. And again, we've written a lot of, we've provided a lot of resources on all of those places if people are just curious or want to learn more.
Awesome. And we will make sure we post all of those in the comments section on the live so folks can have access to that right away. So unfortunately, that's the end of our hour. I feel like I could listen to you talk about this for weeks on end, let alone just an hour. And I just want to thank you again, TL, to you and to everyone who's listening for joining us and talking about this, and what I hope is beginning the conversation that will lead to action. We would like to join you, at least in a small way, of becoming one of the organizations also calling for video phones. So I hope we can connect and see what we can do about that. And we'll be reaching out to the network to see if we can join that statement as well. So, you know, I know that this is a difficult time, and your expertise and time is so appreciated. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who is watching or participating, and we hope to keep doing more good work together.
Thanks to the interpreters and captioners.
Yes, thank you all so much.